I need to say, first of all, that Brigid and I are deeply honoured to receive the Mary Redmond Award. This was not something we saw coming, and we never really thought it would, things like that happen. I mean, they're not some things you consider, but we're deeply honoured to receive it and deeply humbled to have been chosen by the Board of the Wheel. Both Brigid and I knew Mary Redmond, and we had a lot of discussions and engagement with her in the whole build-up to the founding of the Wheel, setting up of the Wheel. She was a person who recognised the community and voluntary sector's capacity and potential, and she worked to harness that potential by founding the Wheel. And I think the work of the Wheel itself is a mighty tribute to Mary today. The sector is making a huge contribution to Irish society. It's got 30,000 plus organisations out there, all contributing to the common good and run by volunteers. And I think they're the two key things I want to just draw attention to, that these are organisations focused principally on the common good in their own situations, wherever they are, and they're all run by volunteers. The annual turnover is, these are numbers you know, but it's good to mention them again. The annual turnover of 14.5 billion, there's 190,000 staff, there's 50,000 volunteer board members, there's 500,000 volunteers contributing more than 2 billion a year worth of effort. The total value of the contribution of the sector is probably at this point somewhere around 30 billion a year. So I think that's an extraordinary statement of the reality that is the community and voluntary sector. I've been asked to say a few words on, maybe as Vincent says, maybe more than a few, on the situation of the sector today. And what I want to do is I want to identify a series of challenges that I see, 5 challenges I see facing the sector, 5 responses, and I also want to identify, in a summary way, 5 kind of priorities or focuses going forward. The first challenge I see is that the sector itself is not really valued. Now, it's valued by some people, big time, but it's also, if you like, not seen for the value that it actually is. The sector quickly identifies challenges when they emerge. It immobilizes rapid responses to needs across society. It has a huge local knowledge on which to build appropriate and flexible responses. However, it's seen by some as a kind of a cheap version of the public sector. And it's seen by others solely as delivering services, but not working for change. And these are kinds of things that I would see as problematic and undervaluing the sector itself. And very often the research done by organisations within the sector is a bit patronised and dismissed and not taken seriously. So that's one challenge that I see. A second challenge is that the sector is not adequately resourced. During the 2008 to 13 recession, and when we had bailouts and all that sort of stuff, government funding for the community and voluntary sector was reduced dramatically, and this has not yet been fully restored. While almost all the other cuts that were put into place after the crash have been restored, the community and voluntary sector stands out as not being restored. And most of the time, it is the first port of call when government wants to reduce expenditure. At the moment, they're not talking about reducing expenditure, but when they do, it's very much that the community and voluntary funding is one of the first things that gets reduced or cut. While other sides of funding are not maybe given the attention that I think they should. Like, there are large tax breaks that benefit the better off, particularly corporations, and I don't see those getting the same kind of attention in terms of cuts when Ireland is in difficult situations. There's also the reality of the Charities Regulatory Authority and the Governance Code and the Lobbying Register. These are very welcome developments. They're meant to foster transparency and so on, but they have a cost. And there's been very little provision by government for organisations to meet those costs. And as a result, organisations are very often under pressure to provide the funding, that kind of funding. So that's the second issue about the sector not being adequately resourced, and I've already said I also see it as not being respected and valued. The third area is that the sector is excluded from social dialogue. Looking at the record in recent years, one might conclude that the governments only see a value in genuinely consulting the CV sector on major decisions when it's in trouble. For example, when COVID came, there was a huge focus on trying to mobilise and listen to the community and voluntary sector and what it might do and could do. And the sector won the award, was given the Mary Redmond Award last year for the huge amount of work that was done in that space. It was terrific. But the problem I find is that that's the kind of space the government will come running to consult, but that should not be, that's not sufficient. The refusal by government to engage with the sector on policy issues and decision making, and when I say this, I know that it is actually being consulted by some politicians, by some policy makers, but not to the extent that I believe would be correct or the right thing to do. And I think it's underpinned in some cases by a patronising attitude among some politicians and some civil servants. Note, some, I'm not accusing all politicians of being patronising or civil servants either, but there are some. And the sector's contribution and experience is often dismissed in that kind of situation. In my own experience, some politicians and some civil servants see the sector as little more than a nuisance. And I was glad to hear that Taoiseach earlier at this summit acknowledged how much the sector is valued by government. The challenge, though, that he and the government face now is to turn that recognition into action. Go beyond the rhetoric. Let's see the support being put in place, particularly in this issue of social dialogue. And this would require the government adequately to resource the sector, engage with the sector in a meaningful way, in policy-making processes, not just in service delivery. There's a lot of engagement on service delivery, but not nearly enough on policy making. And I'll make some specific proposals on that in a minute or two. One thing I can say right now, however, is that in a well-functioning society in our modern world, I couldn't overstate the importance of civil society working positively with government and keeping relationships alive and potential open. Civil society is more than willing to play its part in this context, and government can count on that continuing. However, we need more evidence beyond the rhetoric to show that government is serious about the same thing. One-sided relationships don't survive. We need a two-sided relationship here. So in all of this, it's important to realise that the community and voluntary sector is deeply committed to the common good and sees that as a central value from which it operates. The common good does not get sufficient consideration in our policy-making structures at the moment, in these days. Social dialogue would benefit enormously from such commitment being at its core. A fourth issue, a fourth challenge, a fourth whatever, issues raised by the community and voluntary sector are often ignored, dismissed, or addressed in a cursory manner. Some examples, and these are only examples. I think most people can make lists of the examples from their own experience in the sector. But one example, the push to privatisation over all else is not acceptable. The community and voluntary sector should not collude in this. The sector has its own value and in many cases can do a better job than the private sector. And there's a place for the private sector. I'm not saying there isn't. There absolutely is. But there needs to be more balance than what we are seeing at the moment. A totally different kind of example is the reality of loneliness in our society today. One of the great causes of problems, health problems of all sorts, mental health issues, all sorts of things. Terrific to see so much awareness of it coming through in our media in recent times. But this is an issue with which the community and voluntary sector has grappled with for years. It has organisations in all sorts of spaces dealing with this issue, and has been trying for a long time to get it on the agenda. It's an example to me of something that the sector has done a huge amount of work in trying to get the message out there, but hasn't been picked up, if you like. A third area that I see, and this is, as I say, these are just examples, and they're different kinds of examples. A third area that I would see where the sector is a bit ignored or dismissed or not really addressed seriously is support for carers. The support for carers today is totally inadequate. 1 in 8 people in Ireland aged over 15 are family carers. More than 500,000 people are currently providing regular, unpaid care. 500,000 people. Imagine the cost if that care had to be paid for. Yet it is not really recognised or supported. I have a suggestion about how that might be addressed in a moment. Fifthly, I said I would identify 5 challenges. Here's the 5th one. Depending on charity or philanthropy to deliver rights is not acceptable or sustainable. If people have rights, they have a right to have them, and they should not be depending on charity or philanthropy. That's not a dismissal of charity or philanthropy. Charity and philanthropy have their place. They're both very important. But the bottom line is, if people have rights, those rights should be built into the structures and should be delivered independent of whether or not there's support from charities or from philanthropists. In fact, I would argue very strongly that securing people's rights should be at the centre of society structures and processes. Just to make a point in all of this, I would be the first to acknowledge the importance of ensuring that the sector always delivers value for money. But I would make the point that I think delivering value for money is a core value of the sector. And if the rest of society delivered value for money along the way, on the same basis as the community and voluntary sector, Ireland would be doing really well, a lot better than it has been doing over the years. So there are 5 challenges. Let's talk quickly about 5 responses to those. The first is about the society or the sector not being valued sufficiently. What I would say is it's important not to be afraid to assert the value and rights of the community and voluntary sector. And if I was to give one piece of advice or one recommendation, it would be to follow the example of Mary Redmond. There was a woman who had no doubts about the capacity and potential, but also did not hold back in naming it, in advocating for it, in promoting it. And I think as a result, just one result of that, and there are many others, just one result, as I've said already, is the wheel. And today's this just shows me, and it should show an awful lot of people, but I've been well aware of it already. But I think it's something that's you should be proud of as an organisation. You do assert the value and the rights of the sector, and I think you got a great example from Mary Redmond, and I think you've followed it extremely well. In terms of the funding, that we're not getting sufficient funding, I would make a suggestion. I think we should, as a sector, argue for doubling the funding that's available to the community and voluntary sector, and to do that over 5 budgets. So over a 5 budget period, so an increase of 20% a year for 5 years is doable. That can be paid for within responsible fiscal parameters. So the Minister for Finance or whoever can't argue that is a mad suggestion that can't be met or paid for. 20% a year for 5 years, and we're in a situation where we've doubled the funding we have today. And I think then the funding issue would be addressed in a serious way. The third area is the social dialogue area, and what I would argue very strongly is for the inclusion of the community and voluntary pillar and the environmental pillar in social dialogue. There's a social dialogue half going on at the moment. Employers and trade unions meet with government in that LEAF project process that they have. The problem with that is it dealing with one part, it's dealing with the economy principally, mostly the economy, and not a lot of other issues, not even the whole economy, that's another story too. But the bottom line in it is that for real engagement, the community and voluntary pillar needs to be there. I'm not arguing that that's a perfect structure, it's not. But it's a structure that is there. None of the other structures that are part of it either, employers and trade unions and farmers, none of these are perfect. But I would argue that ours is just as perfect as they are, insofar as they are. And I think we should be there as part of that social dialogue. The problem most of the time, I would say, is that when if there's a discussion going on about how to allocate the resources of the society, which is what happens in social dialogue. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that's where we are at the moment. And that's why the resources of the sector get constantly gobbled up. Or else all the resources available are gone, perfectly legitimately argued for by employers and trade unions. And then when we come along, there's nothing left. And we're not really engaged in that process. We're excluded from it. Not acceptable to me. A fourth thing was the issue of having the points or the issue that the experience is respected. I would suggest two things. On the loneliness and health issue that I talked about, I think there needs to be substantial additional resourcing for mental health and related items. I think we've had some experiences. I'm not going to document them here. You're all well aware of them. They've all been well carried in the media. In recent times, we need a lot more resourcing of issues around mental health and so on. And on the issue of carers, which I mentioned, and the huge amount of work and contribution made by carers, why don't we think of introducing a basic income for carers? We now have a pilot project out there on a basic income for artists. Why not do one for carers as well? It seems to me that if you were to pick a group like carers and put a basic income system into place, you would have a very powerful statement of how the society takes carers' takes their responsibility seriously and respects it and supports it. I think there's a huge issue for us in that space that we need to be thinking about as a society. Putting a basic income in place for carers would be a real good step in the right direction. Finally, nobody will be surprised in terms of where I'm coming from that I would be arguing for moving towards a rights-based approach and structure across society and across policy making. And I think that's the important thing. Moving on to sort of wrap this up, I would say, looking into the future, I would argue that there should be an overall focus on addressing the social contract. Ireland's social contract is broken. When we talk about the social contract, we're talking about the relationship between government and the people in the society. There is often, in all situations, there's an unwritten kind of understanding of if we do this and this and this, and pay our taxes and keep the law and so on, we get this and this and this in return, okay? What we have at the moment in Ireland is some people doing extremely well, and the economy itself seems to be doing well. But as against that, there are people who are doing extremely badly. We have 2/3 people in poverty. We have huge problems in housing and no plans in place to really get at them. We're making progress, but it's so slow, and it'll be decades at the current rate before we actually get to grips with it. There'll be a whole generation of people seriously damaged, not just excluded, but seriously damaged as a result of that. So it seems to me we need to focus on the social contract. If we're to focus on the social contract, I think to deliver the social contract, I think 5 outcomes are required, 5 outcomes. The first one is we should be working to deliver a thriving economy, with the community and voluntary sector having a serious role in there. But we have to recognize that the argument we've been listening to for decades is rubbish. That is, that it is not true to say that once we get the economy in shape, everything else will follow. Over and over again, Ireland has got its economy in order, and over again, we've had crashes and all sorts of other stuff that we don't want to think about. The bottom line in it is, if you're going to have a thriving economy, you need to do other things simultaneously, not subsequently. And I could not make that point strongly enough or often enough. If you look back, waiting to get the economy right and then do everything else never works. There's no such thing as effective trickle-down effects out of that type of approach. Just think about it. If you need a thriving economy, you must have the second point that I would argue, decent services and infrastructure. If you don't have the infrastructure, housing, public transport, broadband and so on, if you don't have decent services in health and education and so on, then you're not going to have a thriving economy no matter what you do. So you need, second thing, decent services and infrastructure, as well as the thriving economy. They're interacting. But of course, if you're going to deliver infrastructure and services, you must pay for it. So the issue about just taxation, how much of it should be paid by taxation, how much should be paid from other sources, those kinds of discussions need to take place, and we need a just taxation system, and not a system like we have at the moment, where there's sort of the fallback seems to be automatically, if we need extra tax, that we'll go to the community, that we go to the PAYE worker, basically, and not deal with the sort of huge tax breaks of the corporate sector. For example, it's only an example. Okay? So just taxation has to be in there at the same time as well. A fourth issue is real participation. If there are decisions being taken that impact on people today, people want to be involved in those decision-making processes. It's not good enough for people to sit and watch others make the decision and hand them down and that they have no say. People reject that. A good example of the current thing is of the current situation, the community, the public participation networks are part of policy engagement at a local level, and there's, as Vincent pointed out, there's 18,000 plus organizations now, community voluntary and environmental social inclusion organizations involved in the public participation networks across the country. And by the way, when I talked about doubling the money for the community and voluntary sector, I mean, I'd include doubling the money for public participation networks within that. But the real participation is required in this context. And finally, to have a sustainable society, to have a social contract that works and includes everybody, then you have to have sustainability. And it's environmental sustainability, it's also economic sustainability, because the economic model has to work, and not alone that, but it's social sustainability as well, because it means that it's important that we're able to live in a society and that we want to live in, and that is sustainable, that we know is sustainable in the long run. Some key issues at the moment are not sustainable, and that's quite obvious to a lot of people. So they're the kinds of targets I would talk about, or I would set out and suggest as part of a focus on developing a new social contract and dealing with the reality that Ireland's current social contract is broken. And so, in conclusion, you'll be glad to know. I want to say two things. The first thing is the wheel plays a major role in addressing all the challenges I have listed here and in seeking out viable solutions. And I salute you, Brigid salutes you in this context. This organization does a terrific job trying to mobilize literally thousands of organizations and trying to give them a focus and a direction and servicing and providing huge supports. So well done to the wheel. And the second thing I wanted to say is that as you conclude your annual summit today, I want to thank you and all the members of the wheel for the contribution you have made and are making, and to wish you the strength and resilience required to move forward with confidence and commitment to make your unique contribution to the building of a fairer future for everyone in Ireland today and tomorrow. Thank you.